Alaskan gold miners have a saying about what comes up with the gravel. Sometimes you find the gold, and sometimes the gold finds you something older. Since the late 1800s, placer miners, the kind who blast and sluice frozen earth to reach pay dirt, have been pulling up bones. Not small bones, tusks the length of a pickup truck bed, skulls the size of boulders, femurs so dense and heavy that the miners throw their backs lifting them. The permafrost of interior Alaska is one of the greatest natural deep freezes on the planet, and it has been quietly storing the remains of an entire lost world, one ice age creature at a time. Today I want to take you into that world, because what comes out of Alaska's frozen ground is not just impressive, it is a window into a catastrophe so total, so strange, and so hotly debated that scientists have been arguing about it for more than 2 centuries. We are going to walk through the Boneyard together. We will meet the animals that once roamed this place in numbers that defy belief. We will stand at the edge of the greatest mass extinction our species has ever witnessed firsthand. And we will sit with the question that still does not have a clean answer. Why did they all disappear? Let me start with the ground itself, because the ground is the real story here. Interior Alaska sits on a layer of permanently frozen soil called permafrost that, in some places, runs hundreds of feet deep. It formed during the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, give or take, when temperatures plummeted, and the ground froze solid and stayed that way. The remarkable thing about permafrost is what it does to organic material. Slow decay nearly to a standstill. Remove almost all the oxygen that microbes need to break tissue down, and what you get, over thousands of years, is a kind of accidental cryogenic vault. When placer miners cut into that frozen substrate, hydraulically blasting the hillsides or running the melt through sluice boxes, they are not just looking for gold. They are dismantling a time capsule. And what spills out alongside the black sand and the occasional nugget is staggering. Bones come up still stained with mineral color, their internal architecture intact, the grain of the cortex still readable under a hand lens. Tusks emerge curved and whole, the ivory discolored but solid. In rare and genuinely extraordinary cases, miners have pulled out partial mummies, animals preserved with hide, hair, and even internal organs still present, flash frozen so quickly at death that the last meal is sometimes still in the stomach. Think about that for a moment. You are eating grass on a cold afternoon roughly 12 to 15,000 years ago. The world ends for you quickly, as worlds tend to. And then, one unremarkable June morning in the 21st century, a hydraulic nozzle the size of a fire hose cuts through the hillside above you, and there you are again. Now who were these animals? Because the Boneyard of Alaska is not a single species. It is a whole ecosystem. A menagerie of creatures so outsized compared to anything living today that they read almost like mythology. The woolly mammoth is the headline act, and rightly so. These were not the gentle, lumbering giants of children's books. Mature bulls could stand over 11 feet at the shoulder and carry tusks that spiraled out more than 10 feet in front of them. Those tusks were not primarily weapons. Researchers believe they were used to scrape snow and ice from tundra vegetation in winter, essentially functioning as plows. The mammoth's coat was layered, coarse outer guard hairs over a dense underfur that could trap body heat even in brutal Arctic wind. They were exquisitely engineered for the environment they lived in. But the mammoths shared Alaska with animals that deserve equal billing. The steppe bison, ancestral to the modern American bison but considerably larger, roamed in herds that by some estimates rivaled the vast bison populations of the historic Great Plains. The Yukon horse, a stocky, cold-adapted species genetically distinct from the horses that Europeans later reintroduced to North America, was everywhere. The American lion, bigger than any lion alive today, hunted across the open steppe. The short-faced bear, which was tall enough at the shoulder to look a modern grizzly in the eye while on all fours, ranged across the continent. The giant ground sloth, which could rear up to a height that would make a basketball hoop look modest, browsed the shrubby vegetation of what is now the Alaskan interior. This was not an empty, frozen wasteland. This was a thriving, densely populated world. Geologists and paleontologists have a name for the biome that made all of it possible: the mammoth steppe. And to understand the mammoth steppe, you have to understand a place that no longer exists at all. Beneath the shallow waters of what is now the Bering Sea lies a drowned landscape called Beringia. During the last glacial maximum, So much of the world's water was locked up in continental ice sheets that global sea levels dropped by a substantial margin. Estimates run to well over 300 feet lower than today. That exposed a landmass connecting what is now Siberia to what is now Alaska. Not a narrow bridge, despite what the term implies. Beringia at its widest was roughly 1,000 miles from north to south. It was a continent in its own right, and Beringia was not frozen tundra. This is one of the most counterintuitive facts in this whole story. The great glaciers of the Ice Age largely bypassed Beringia. The region sat in a cold shadow, but it was also strangely dry. Snowfall was low. Rather than accumulating under deep ice, the land stayed exposed, and what grew there was the productive cold steppe. Grasses, sedges, sage, and flowering plants that could feed enormous populations of large animals year-round. Beringia was the crossroads. Mammoths and horses moved east into North America across it. Later, humans moved east across it too. The bones that come up in Alaskan gold cuts are the physical remnants of that world. The animals that lived and died on both sides of a bridge that the rising seas eventually swallowed. When the glaciers finally began their long retreat, roughly 15 to 12,000 years ago, though the timing varied regionally, everything changed. The ice melted, sea levels rose, Beringia drowned. The mammoth steppe, which had thrived precisely because of the cold, dry conditions, began to break apart as a wetter, warmer climate transformed it into boreal forest, peat bog, and scrubland that could not support the same density of large grazers. And then, in geological terms, astonishingly quickly, nearly every large animal in the Americas went extinct. The woolly mammoth, gone. The horse, gone from the Americas entirely. It would not return for thousands of years, brought back by Spanish explorers of all things. The American lion, the short-faced bear, the giant ground sloth, the steppe bison's full genetic lineage, gone, reduced, or transformed beyond recognition. In North America alone, something in the range of 30 to 40 genera of large mammals vanished in a geologically brief window. It is one of the most dramatic biological collapses in the history of this planet, and the argument about why it happened is one of the great unresolved debates in all of science. The two main camps have been fighting this out for decades, and if you have spent any time reading about this period, you know the names of both hypotheses. The first is climate change, the argument that the end of the Ice Age transformed the landscape so rapidly and so completely that the megafauna simply could not adapt. The mammoth steppe collapsed. The food supply fractured. Populations crashed below the minimum viable threshold and spiraled toward extinction. This is the argument that does not require any human villain, and it is supported by the deep geological record, showing that previous glacial cycles also stressed megafauna populations, even if they did not wipe them out entirely. The second argument is overkill, the idea that the first humans to arrive in the Americas, moving through a landscape of animals that had never encountered an upright, spear-wielding primate before, hunted the largest, slowest reproducing species to extinction. This hypothesis, associated strongly with the work of the ecologist Paul Martin in the latter half of the 20th century, points out a striking coincidence. Everywhere humans arrived, megafauna disappeared. Australia, roughly 50,000 years ago. The Americas, roughly 13 to 11,000 years ago. Island after island in the Pacific and the Mediterranean, all following the same pattern. Humans show up, and within a few thousand years, the big animals are gone. The truth, and I will be honest with you here, is almost certainly messier than either camp wants to admit. Most researchers today work somewhere in the middle, a combination of habitat disruption from rapid climate change and hunting pressure from newly arrived humans, compounding each other in ways that neither force alone could have achieved. A species already stressed by a shrinking food base is far more vulnerable to even modest hunting pressure. A population that might have recovered from climate shifts in a previous interglacial period now had a new variable it had never evolved to handle: us. And this is where standing at the edge of Alaska's Boneyard starts to feel less like a history lesson and more like something you carry with you. Because the animals that come out of that frozen ground are not abstractions. The mammoth mummies have eyelashes. They have skin folds. They have the remnants of their last meals. They are individuals, preserved with a specificity that makes them feel suddenly, uncomfortably close. And their disappearance, whether driven by ice or by spear, happened at the threshold of the human world as we know it. If you love this kind of deep history, the questions that do not have neat answers, the bones that outlast every civilization built on top of them, then this is exactly the kind of community you belong in here at the Thaw Line. If you are not subscribed yet, come join us. We chase these mysteries every week, and we always leave room for the viewer who spots something we missed. There is one more layer to this, and it is the one that genuinely keeps scientists up at night. DNA extracted from permafrost-preserved mammoth remains, and the technology for this has improved dramatically over the last couple of decades, has opened a completely new line of inquiry. We can now see how genetically diverse mammoth populations were across different time periods. We can track when populations began to contract, when they became isolated, when the gene pool narrowed dangerously. The picture that emerges from this molecular archaeology is of a species already in demographic trouble by the time humans arrived in force, but also of populations that held on far longer than the traditional story suggested. A small population of woolly mammoths survived on Wrangel Island off the Siberian coast until roughly 4,000 years ago. The pyramids of Giza were already ancient when the last mammoths died. That detail should stop you cold. 4,000 years ago is not prehistory in the way we usually think of it. That is the Bronze Age. That is written history. That is the world of pharaohs and cuneiform tablets, and the beginning of the alphabet. And somewhere on a cold island in the Arctic, a small herd of woolly mammoths was still walking around, genetically isolated, probably inbreeding, the last remnant of a world that had already been gone for thousands of years everywhere else. The bones that Alaskan gold miners pull from the permafrost are not just fossils in the traditional sense. They are something more than that. They are a record of what the world was before the threshold we crossed, before the combination of warming climate and human arrival permanently rewrote the biology of an entire hemisphere. Each tusk, each femur, each frozen fragment of hide is a data point in a story we are still only partially reading. And the permafrost, as it thaws, and it is thawing, faster now than it has in all the time it has been frozen, releases more of that record every year. Bones that have been locked in cold storage for 12,000 years are emerging not just in gold cuts but along riverbanks, in slumping hillsides, in the shores of lakes that are slowly eating their own edges. Alaska's Boneyard is opening itself up, whether we are ready or not. The question of what these animals were, how they lived, and why they vanished is not settled. It is not close to settled. The science is genuinely ongoing, and the answers keep getting revised as new specimens emerge and new analytical tools let us read the evidence at finer and finer resolution. That is what makes this field so extraordinary. The deeper you dig, literally and figuratively, the more complicated and more astonishing the picture becomes. I find that deeply hopeful, actually. In a world that often feels like it has been thoroughly mapped and cataloged, here is a whole lost world still emerging from the ice, still asking to be understood. So let me leave you with this. The next time someone mentions a mammoth tusk coming out of an Alaskan gold cut, I want you to think past the novelty of it. Think about the ecosystem that tusks supported. Think about the landscape that no longer exists beneath the Bering Sea. Think about the very first human beings who walked into North America and found a world so full of life it must have seemed inexhaustible. And then think about how quickly that fullness went quiet. What do you think actually ended the megafauna? Was it the climate? Was it us? Or was it the unlucky collision of both at exactly the wrong moment? Tell me your theory in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you land on this one, because this community has surprised me before with the depth of thinking you bring to questions like this. If you want to stay in the deep end of history's strangest unsolved questions, the next video goes somewhere equally unexpected. We are following the trail of a lost migration that geneticists have only recently begun to trace in human DNA. A population of people who reached the Americas and then seem to have simply vanished. I think you are going to find it fascinating. Until then, keep digging. I will see you at the next mystery.